What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I am on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Robert Skrobe, and we talk about design sprints, and in particular, what he has learned from hosting the global virtual design sprints. I think there were 5 of them this year, so stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, why don't you visit workshops.work and download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy. Hello, Robert. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We're just discussing that you have a slow Friday morning and I have a very slow Friday evening on my end.
So our conversation is going to start like this. Very low DJ voice all the way through.
And I am sure that we'll discover enough food for creative thoughts and energy along the way.
I agree.
Yes, because you kicked off the Dallas Design Sprint online this week. And I'm looking forward to hear about your learnings.
Yeah, the Global Virtual Design Sprint. This is the 5th one that I've done since last year, or 2 years ago, actually. It's, for those that don't know about it, it's essentially professionals from all around the world getting together to work on a month-long process. And just saying month-long process could tire some people out, but it's well spread out. And the whole goal of it is to showcase professionals in their best light. So to broadcast and showcase what they're capable of, what they're interested in, how they get along with others, and having that all culminate in a showcase at the end of the month. So they can take that away for their portfolios, for their social media posts, for their resumes, or anything else that they'd like to kind of take away from it. Usually the big benefit of the event is that a lot of people get to network with one another that they normally would never have, but they network in a way that's intimate. So they are working in small teams with each other on projects of social good. So whether the United Nations initiatives or other such projects, they're usually all coming together for those.
Wonderful. And I think the networking around content and a meaningful goal that they share is usually the best environment to really create connections.
And it organically manifests usually within the teams. Once everyone gets to know one another and what they're capable of and what they like to do, there's a willingness to empathize, to share with one another, and to work through the design sprint process and the prototyping as well to see what happens. So everyone's very interested in learning and sharing with one another.
Yeah, I made similar experiences with mastermind groups where everyone comes in with their own topic, but through the fact of sharing and supporting each other, it really creates very strong bonds. And before we dive in further into that, I always start with a question: when did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And I don't want to skip that one because I'm very curious.
I don't know when. I don't even think I called myself a facilitator ever. I just kind of stumbled into it. I think it was the act of doing online events, hosting them, doing kickoffs like I'm doing now, over and over and over and over again in a virtual environment where I just decided, okay, it's kind of happening. But that's on the design sprint front. If you want to project facilitator out into organizer or managing things, I've been doing that for such a long time. You can talk about when I started up the Usability Professionals Association in Seattle back in the mid-2000s, when I was organizing an online gaming group for kids that were disadvantaged, from disadvantaged youth, to basically give them an outlet to socialize with other kids their age while working on their grades and having some events to go with. There's just dozens of examples of organizing groups together into things. I think this is just an extension of that.
Mm. And I'm tempted to ask the question, what would make the difference between an organizer and a facilitator? But actually, what I'm really interested in is, what have you learned from this project of organizing the community of the disabled children for the work you're doing today?
Between like what lessons were learned then versus what they amounted to today, that it's not about you. Anytime you put yourself as you can, if you want. I mean, some people have that natural affinity to do so, like they're the cat's meow. But when you have the mindset, start developing the mindset of a servant leader, it becomes readily apparent that you're a vehicle for them to getting from one place to the next. Without you, they wouldn't have that option in their lives. So it's the same thing today. The GVDS exists because I would say, compassionate towards people and their professional careers and where they want to go, because my own was, I didn't have much help along the way. So I guess my involvement is basically a reflection of me trying to move the needle forward for people that normally wouldn't have that option.
What was the moment that you decided to actually fully engage in that project and to scale it in a way that you did?
Which project are you referring to?
The online design sprint, or the Dallas design sprints in general, that started
to be clear,
way earlier.
The Dallas Design Sprints is the name of the company that I run. That I decided to do that because there was so much of the market was growing exponentially for that service, and it just seemed like a natural extension of what I was doing anyway. So I decided to start it up. The GVDS was based on the theory that everything we were doing in a physical environment was going online. That was in mid 2018. It just seemed more practical. You didn't have to physically get everyone in the same space to work on something. You could record everything. You didn't have to get tons of supplies. All of them were created digitally. And you could work with people in multiple time zones. But at the time, the culture around, in workshopping and facilitating was always, well, you have to be in the room to have that interpersonal communication and understand what people are doing. And I didn't believe that. I thought that, well, it's not just one dimension, it's multiple. And I had careers before that where I was working virtually all the time. I was in Seattle and the main office was in Brisbane, California, or was over in England, or was in Ireland. So I knew that the group around the process that were very enthusiastic about it didn't have that luxury of that experience. So I stuck to my guns, and I said, look, there's remote where some people are in a room, there's one person remote. That's not what I'm talking about. It's where everyone has their own screen and they're all working on something virtually and working out the same whiteboard. Got a lot of pushback all across the board. Never going to happen. Luckily, I had a handful of people that were interested in trying it out. And their motivation was they had just gotten a masterclass certification, which, by the way, I think are useless. They serve no purpose. It makes you feel good, but I'll digress. They had gotten a masterclass certificate and they had no way to practice. There wasn't any runway at work. They didn't have any external projects that they could apply this process to beyond just kind of working it into their day-to-day. So they said, well, all right, let's try this out. So we connected with people in Germany, with the UK, Hong Kong, here in the US, North Carolina. And we all kind of experimented with doing it online. And it ended up from being what I thought was being one team, it ended up being 6. Wow. And it was about 62 people. And they continued to work on the projects even after we had gotten done with our process. And I was like, this is interesting.
There's something to it. Nice.
Yep, there's something there. And then fast forward to today, and it's a thing. It's an ever evolving thing, because it's not just a plug and play thing. It's learning what works and what does not work with the given constraints.
And we're gonna dive into that. Before, what is it that you think creates the opportunity to really connect in a meaningful way online? Because you faced all these pushbacks. And I think that we learned now through the lockdown, through the COVID pandemic, that more is possible online than we would have thought. But I think there's still concerns, and still many people believe that we cannot have the same connection to each other. And I don't believe that it's about the touch or the smell. So what does it take to have this online?
I think it's a separation between being human and doing your work. And that's a very, very simple way of thinking about it. So ideally, the one thing that this pandemic state is going to enforce is that you don't need to physically get together to do work. I think it's playing itself out in commercial real estate. In the big cities here in the US, like New York and California, firms and companies are looking at, why are we paying such expensive leases for buildings that nobody's going to use? Why do we need to bring everybody together? Now, it's different for the executive class because normally that they require that interpersonal communication and that connection. So it depends on who you're talking about. But I think the future of work is looking like you get together in person to meet one another, to relate as human beings and to start relationships. So you have that connection, but you do it outside of the work. You do it so that you just basically get to know one another, figure out whether you like each other or not. But the work itself, we have plenty of tools and processes now and evidence and rationale to show that it makes good business sense to do most, if not all, of your work online. If it's intelligence work or things that don't require physical pieces, like DNA sampling and things like that. You can't, unless you have your robotics are up to speed and you have that kind of backdrop, you can't really do it unless you're, doing it in person. But yeah, I would say that it really comes down to getting together offline, outside of work, in some capacity that makes sense for everyone if they're interested. And then the work is pretty much, for the most part, the kind of work that I do is pretty much online only.
And still, what you said is that with GVDS, you experienced that this connection can be created across the globe amongst teams who have never met offline. Mm-hmm. What are you doing to facilitate that?
Kind of get them all in the same space at the same time. And just the natural affinity humans have for one another kind of takes over. So the trick is you can't put process in front of everything. You can't put like an agenda of every 5, 10, 15-minute blocks are happening within a particular time frame to get everything done. Then people will naturally feel like they're just going through a system. But if you work in big blocks of time where you're exchanging points of view after kind of going through a little bit of process, like kind of ideating a bit and getting some perspective, that's one thing. I think that offline and asynchronous working is it's extremely underrated. I think it's the magic sauce that makes a group happen. I think that outside of official online together meetings, the offline alone or the offline together is what binds a team the most. Sharing what they know, doing small little WhatsApp meetups, or just doing small calls in Slack, just to exchange points of view, or to just basically, just have a chat about things that they're interested in. It's the small little connections that usually provide the foundation for a much more meaningful connection on a group level. But you only get that if you encourage it. If you don't say, okay, just do your own work, and then we're going to wait until this day to kind of do show and tell. You have to kind of encourage people to say, it's okay, you're in a safe environment. You all can communicate and connect with one another as it makes sense to do so. You don't need me to kind of act as the fire starter to get things going. So my answer to your question would be that to manifest those kinds of meaningful relationships, it has to be multifaceted. So you have to have an emphasis on offline together or offline alone work and communication, with the online together time not being about just basically spending 45 minutes talking to a void, where some people can use that as a social vortex and just, they just take up the entire time. It's more those online together times are more for decision making. They're more for execution. And then they're for getting past a conversation quickly, or getting past, getting some understanding, and then moving forward on a topic of concern. And if they're still concerned, then you kind of allocate more time to it, but it's essentially the same thing. Your online time is more for execution and more for moving things forward.
Yeah, I agree that the real magic happens in these moments of asynchronous work and short encounters. And I'm still fascinated by the dynamics of these encounters because, for instance, I love the opportunity that, for instance, Mural or any online whiteboard gives, that a group can continue to work on the same thing asynchronously because the post-it notes don't fall off the wall. And still, I have the impression that it really takes a lot of facilitation or encouragement to do that because it's not a habit yet. So how do you encourage that, or even engagement on Slack?
I think if it's forced, it's a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you tell people to kind of do certain things over and over again, they're going to not do that. I mean, I think that goes back to childhood. You're told multiple ways, you're going to be like, no, I really don't feel like being controlled, so it's not going to work. I find that when other humans see other humans do things, they tend to kind of tag along. So if you lead by example and show how things are done, whether it's in video. So if you have a video accompanying with your mural, say, here's how this particular part works. That's one way of doing it. Another is just the peer pressure that comes along with 2 or 3 or 4 people, going through the motions. And then some of your participants begrudgingly will just kind of go, okay, well, I need to kind of here's the bar, here's the lowest part of the bar, and I need to be here. But that doesn't mean they're not contributing across the board. They may be there's one person I'm thinking of that is just amazing at research. And they go silent for long periods of time, but when they're needed and they know that the deadline's coming up to understand, like, say, lightning demos for a design sprint, they come up with these fantastic examples from like Product Hunt and other places that we never would have known, that really enrich the team's thinking. So sometimes it's being patient with everyone, that if they need help, they'll ask for it. But also providing the environment to say, if you're stuck with something, or if you're not sure about doing something, then just ask. And as long as that's reflected in the behavior, in the online time and in your language, then you're reinforcing what you're saying. But I don't, by default, I don't force people to do anything. They're going to choose to do what they want to do.
And still you make it easy for them to play along and to join through basically what you just mentioned, the videos. So in our exploration call, you mentioned that you record Loom videos and post them on the mural, for instance.
Yeah, and sometimes if I'm feeling quirky, I'll fire up Snap Camera, which is a third-party tool that puts some sort of like digital rendering on your face, like a happy face, or makeup, or turns me into a baby, and then I use that as like something I do during the video, just something fun to do, so that it's not just instructional, but it's meant to be
entertaining.
Meant to be fun, yeah. But the thing I have to watch out for is I'm really bad at accents, and I know that some people are sensitive about that. So I can come across being very insensitive about that. So the only one I ever do is just the old man Texan, and kind of go in that direction. But other than that, I don't try to do anything like this because
too much provocation.
I'm terrible at it. So,
and I would love to learn about your experience from having these GVDS, online design sprints, because design sprint is in everyone's ear. I'm not sure whether everyone is really familiar with the concept of a design sprint. So maybe we can start with that.
I can explain it in very simple terms. I mean, you could Google design sprint and you'll find tons of different stuff about it. But I always try to explain it in a way so that I'm explaining it to my mother or a relative. Basically, in a nutshell, you take an idea or a challenge that you have, and through this process, you take 4 days, usually the dedicated time, with a group of people that have different skill sets and different experiences than you do. And by the end of it, you have tested an idea, a novel idea that you all agree upon, with 5 people to see if it's worth doing. And the difference is that you can say it saves you time and money, time and expense really, from having to go through 3.5, 4 months of a lean startup or anything else, only to discover that all the time and money you put into, you were actually designing the wrong thing.
Mm. And with all the buzz around the word and all the different outcomes when you Google it, what do you think most people get wrong about the concept of a design sprint?
That is a silver bullet.
Mm.
It's a particular tool for particular situations. And a lot of times people have tried to retrofit it for strategy, marketing, startups, other things. But the history of process would indicate that there's a million and one ways to cut a slice of cheese. It just depends on your situation, your context. A lot of people can be dogmatic about the process, meaning that they see all the benefits from it because they've bought into it completely. Most people just don't really care about the how. They want to know how you can fix their pain or how you can solve their problem. They just want to know that you're the right person to do the job and that you can do it without having to explain how fantastic your tools are. So it's definitely that you have to get away from the notion that the design sprint is something that's going to solve the innovation problems of a company or to solve the process that let's say like a product development team of designers and developers would normally use. Since the process has been out since I think 2018 now, most design forward-thinking shops and groups have already incorporated it in some way with their process. They've already done bits and pieces of it. They've already tried it. They've taken what works and what doesn't, and they've incorporated it into their process. These days, design sprints are really hybrid models, and that's what we're doing in GVDS. Everything we take parts of the original recipe. We take what seems to be relevant in an online context, and we mix and match them with more effective methods that have been proven out through experimentation and through other people's experience.
And from this process, what are your biggest learnings?
In terms of the hybrid process?
Yeah.
Do you ever feel you're tired of the trip from home to the home office? That the physical confines of your house are not getting you the exposure to the new ideas that you need? Maybe you need Mastermind. At Mastermind, you work together with a group of peers who will help you bring new perspectives to your challenges, to find new solutions, and who you can even give a little bit back to by helping them solve their problems. In a compressed 2 hours, you'll get a day's worth of learning. So why don't you get out of that box and come to Mastermind? Workshops.work/mastermind.
That you have to allow people to put their own skin in the game when it comes to figuring out what the solution is.
What does that mean?
They have to feel a sense of ownership or a sense that part of what you've created is something that they've contributed. So for most people that are unfamiliar with the design sprint process, it's perfectly fine to read the book by Jake Knapp or the one by Richard Banfield. There's a black book on design sprints to get familiar with the concept. You can read articles and watch a lot of YouTube videos, Vimeo videos on the process. But it really comes down to what makes sense for the kind of outcomes that you want to have, or what kind of outputs you want to have. I'll give an example. Through repetitive design sprint processes, I found that there are a handful of traditional exercises that are showcased in the Blue Book and Jake Knapp's Sprint book that are either outdated or that they don't produce the right outcomes for what the team needs. Crazy Eights is one of them. That is a process where traditionally you fold a piece of paper into 4 folds, which creates 8 like kind of folded squares. And each minute you draw a variation of an idea to kind of really vet out all the different dimensions of it. But what I've found is that even if somebody works alone in that capacity and then brings up their idea, there's more benefit to doing a couple of things. One is to stop at sketch 4. That was the first variant, where everyone shares what they're doing. And then people can, the team can kind of learn from one another early rather than at the end. The second is that not everyone knows how to draw. And there's been talk about you can get around that by doing writing words and other things. But that's been a headwind that keeps on coming up, where that's usually an indication that there's an issue with the process, where it's not allowing people to really communicate what they're thinking in an effective way that really helps the team. So with that discovery, after seeing it over and over again in the third GVDS, the crazy eights were dropped. And in its place were nothing at all, or that the idea is that we were going to do a bit of, I forget the process. Well, you start, one group starts with kind of sketching out their ideas, and then they show everyone what they're doing. And then you have your original idea, but then you have how somebody interprets it. So I forget the name of it, but you have your original sketch that you work on for a little bit. Then you randomly give it to somebody else, and then they augment it. They add to it
their own. Like a yes and exercise.
Exactly, you got it. But it's under a different name. Yeah. And what we found is that for the couple teams that have tried it, it's been the being able to relate to a point of view is much stronger around somebody's approach to the concept or approach to their idea, where they wouldn't have that insight before because somebody's seeing outside of their own kind of dimension. So that has been a value add in an extreme way. And that's, so coming up to GVDS 5, there's going to be a set recipe that's usually involved with the 4 days that people are going to get together online. That exercise is going to be an option for people to add into their online workday, so that they can basically budget the amount of time they want to use for which activities to get the right kind of outcomes. So we personalize it based on the team, and the team decides what they want to choose for those types of activities.
And both examples that you're just giving are perfectly aligning also with what you called having skin in the game. So if I build on the idea of someone else, then I have skin in the game in the final outcome because I contributed. So it's basically the IKEA effect. You appreciate more what you build yourself.
Yes, and you will start to understand the thinking and the rationale of your teammates, especially if they see things differently. If you have somebody who's a creative mind, they have a different approach.
Yeah.
If you have somebody who's very business oriented and looks at things from a very high level view and wants to know concepts versus like details, then you're going to have that dimension to your idea. But that's where it really comes together. We found that if you share them more than once, it starts to get a little diluted, but just one impression may completely change a person's approach to how they see things.
And I think it creates an understanding of the different perspectives early in the process, because you catch it. If you lose someone's thought process, then after the crazy eight, it might be too late to actually really understand where this person was coming from and going. But if you're building on each other's step, then you see exactly where you're deriving or where you have totally different perspectives on a similar thing. And this creates another opportunity for a conversation and more creative ideas.
Right. And then the follow-through is usually the solution sketch, which sets the stage for storyboarding and prototyping. But what we found was that in that solution sketch, traditionally it's 3 steps, but I've seen it now manifest so that becomes a storyboard that takes into account both points of view. So literally people will start writing stories. The solution sketch is supposed to be a high-level kind of three-step approach, but we found that that's okay. To kind of, make sure that the main points are across and people can react to them and put heat maps around certain ideas and then put comments and questions. But for some, it's like they can see the entire vision. They can literally go from 3 steps to 8 or to 6. And in a virtual environment, that's totally fine because the tools allow for an expansion of your original idea in a very quick way, so that you can have your analog sketch that you upload, but then you can tell the story as you kind of see it. But I don't necessarily just say, no, just do the solution sketch. We just want to see how people think. And if people feel free to kind of express themselves in that way, it just enriches the conversation even more.
Yeah. What makes a design sprint fail?
A dogmatic obsession with process.
You basically.
That's one.
Yeah.
That's one. The second is when someone outside of the process highly influences either the direction or a change in direction. So usually with design process sprints, there's a stakeholder, or there's someone that's, if it's external or internal, usually there's somebody either funding it or putting political backing behind it. That person may have undue influence on what's going on, and if they don't like where it's headed, they will change things. If someone external to the design sprint comes in and wants to make sure that it has his or her 2 cents, then they may introduce some process that they're very familiar with and disregard the wishes and the organization of the facilitators and the stakeholders that are starting it up. So usually it's the reliance on the process to save the day, which doesn't always work, and then people outside of the design sprint or inside the design sprint that want to change the agenda or change the approach. Those are the top 2 typically. And for online environments, third, sometimes it's just apathy. Sometimes people they say, you know what, this is great, but I have other things to do. And they don't necessarily say it that way. They will put meetings or other things that they're coming up that they need to take care of, that the business wants them to take care of. So that usually comes into play as well.
And it's interesting because while you were explaining that, I usually ask the question, what makes a workshop fail? And these are perfect examples, I think, that would make any workshop fail. If you're too dogmatic about the process, if someone tries to hijack the workshop or meeting or session or purpose.
And I would define failure as not being able to learn. I wouldn't necessarily equate failure to not being able to get to day 4, day 5 of any process. But essentially, when you put a plant in an environment that doesn't support it well, it's not going to do well. If you need a plant that needs a lot of sun and you plant it in the shade, it's probably not going to do as well. If you put it in dry soil rather than wet soil with a lot of nutrients, it's probably not going to grow or hook in as fast. I think there's a lot to be said about having the right context for what you're doing. That really speaks to whether or not the success is going to be there. I find that if everyone learns and everyone has appreciation for what people do and the problem that you're taking on, that's a success in and of itself. Whether or not you are successful in getting a prototype that meets the needs and the outcomes of the business or the organization, or you have something fully functional rather than just having 2 or 3 pages in, say, like a web app that you're developing, the baseline definition of success for me is whether or not people have learned something or felt like they have come away with some new perspective or new appreciation for either the process or the people involved.
I totally agree, and this is what for me makes the involvement also sustainable. So if you learn something about the process and the perspectives, you can still apply it, even if you don't come to the prototype or you find out that it doesn't work, the prototype is a failure, the solution, then at least you know how to go through such a process again to come up with something better once you really embrace the learning.
I also think we need to get past, and this is really hard for humans, to get past the idea that failure is bad. I am actively learning that failure is like is the best friend of success. People have so much built into whether or not something is successful or not, but that's not the point. It's just that's the end result of a series of sequential events as to whether or not it reaches a certain self-defined conclusion. I think the way to approach it is that you're going on a pattern where you're on a pattern of discovery, and you're classifying a situation or something that happens as successful or a failure. But that is going to be different for every individual, depending on what they project onto that body of work that you're doing or the end result. And sometimes those failures are so self-declared that you're really, shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak. If you're being paid to do something and you fail to kind of do the necessary things that are required to have that you've contracted to do, that's something different. What I'm speaking specifically about is the end result of a lot of work that you're doing for, say, a design sprint or a workshop. You can't control that outcome because of all the human beings that are involved. And you have to look at what you've done as what have you taken away from this? What's been the experience? What did you get right and not get right? And then how are you going to basically move forward? How are you going to continue? You're now at a different level because of the experience. How are you going to challenge yourself at that level to move to a different level? And that's the game. That's the real game. It's not obsessing over success or failure. We're going to have a different perspective on things, you and I, just from this conversation. And we're going to move on to other things that we do. But the conversation that we've had here will unknowingly sometimes influence how we take on the rest of our day, or perhaps this subject later on during the week, whether I'm in the GVDS or you're talking to somebody else. But that's the way to approach it. Not whether or not this podcast was a success or failure. You can look at analytics and derive it and say like 500,000 listens is where I want to be. If anything less than that is failure. Well, yeah, sure, that's your definition. But what did we learn by kind of having this conversation? What perspectives have we kind of taken from this? Has it validated anything we think? Has it given us a new approach to things? That's where I think it really matters. So I caution against kind of like using failure too liberally, in the sense that it's meant to be, okay, if you get to this failure state, then everything you did before it was not. No, it's just that failure in its definition would indicate that everything collapses, but I don't think it does. I think it's just either it hit or it didn't hit. You throw a dart at a dartboard. Either you get the dart where you think you're going to get it or not, and then you just adjust your throw and learn from next time, and that's rapid succession. So I'm trying to change, I guess, the nature of failure through prototyping and other things that I'm doing.
Thank you. I love your answer. And that's exactly the reason why I keep on asking this question, because I realized that as soon as we phrase it, what makes a workshop or design sprint or whatever fail, there's so many reflections coming out of that, and different perceptions of what failure means to each of my guests. So
maybe if I can make a suggestion, maybe the question is, what makes a design sprint problematic? Because then you're talking about describing the situation or the context. So it doesn't necessarily equate that you're going to have a bad time if somebody who's a third-party person comes in and goes, "We're doing IBM Hills and we're throwing out our personas and everything else." They may have some information that you don't, where you may get frustrated about the fact that you can't do a design sprint anymore. But they may see the bigger picture, where they won't be able to get their funding for their department unless they hit on one or two points that the people that they answer to are looking for.
Don't get me wrong. For me to phrase the question this way, and I had many podcast guests already who suggested different ways of phrasing it. That's my little provocation that I just spark in every time.
It worked.
Yes. And I would like to come back to something that you mentioned before, and I loved the picture that you painted about the soil and the ground and the environment, the context of a design sprint. So what do you think is this soil, this context that really facilitates the team to really make the best use of these 4 days that they're spending together?
Am I allowed to use coarse language on this podcast, or is it G-rated?
Please.
People have to know you're not full of shit. I think that's pretty much it. You have to be genuine with what you're doing when you come to the table. So if you're really there to help to facilitate in a meaningful way, that there isn't a underlying motivation to doing it, like you're not trying to sell something at the same time that you're going through a process. If you're providing, if basically, and I guess a better way to put it is that you're being a servant leader. You're being someone that sees everyone as somebody that you're working for. Like you're working for your participants, not the other way around. You're trying to provide them with everything they need to basically be successful in their mind with this time and energy they're putting to this group. So if you're providing the right amount of time, templates, resources, links, reference, you're available for Q&A, you're there to kind of guide along, you're there to kind of show how things are done. that you're always there to try and help whenever possible. If you're showing by your actions, not by your words, that you're sincerely trying to provide the best experience for people, that's part of the foundation of the soil. It's that you're providing the context, the environment to nurture that kind of growth of a professional in a way that they feel is most appropriate.
And to what extent do the personalities or the participants in each group are relevant? Would you think, because I can imagine that it can be as beneficial for a group to be super diverse, but then I can also imagine that there is maybe a threshold of diversity that when they just stop understanding each other. Or is it then just a way to facilitate this conversation across diversity?
Sometimes you don't know things are problems or things are converging unless they become readily apparent to the group. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes you may get the sense that someone's being very pushy about their point of view and mm-hmm. maybe imposing their perspectives. But the thing is that the rest of the group may feel perfectly fine with it, or they may not really voice their concerns until they tell you offline. Like you'll get messages saying, I'm not sure if I'm right. I may be wrong, but I get the feeling that Gabe is kind of like dominating the conversation mm-hmm. to all the way to someone that says, I'm out. This is not what I signed up for. This person is clearly that we were going to do one thing, and now this person's saying we're doing another, and you're doing damage control and being a detective. And so there's different approaches that different facilitators and people have. You can stay really close to everything to kind of catch things early and try to do that. But the problem is that you're being too controlling, and you could not let people be human beings. And then the opposite side of the spectrum, you just wait till the fires start showing up, and then you kind of come in and try to change things. I don't think there's one right way of doing it. Mm. But I will say that the experience of dealing with issues and with problems over and over again will better equip you to handle them in the future and to recognize when certain behaviors may lead to certain outcomes. Part of what we've done with this new global virtual design sprint is a code of conduct based on what happened in the previous 2 GVDSs, with people just doing things they naturally felt were okay. But what I started to get in back channels, that clearly was not.
Can you give an example?
Closed design sprints, where the event had all their design sprints open. There were a couple of people that wanted to keep it closed because they wanted it self-defined as such that it was very private in nature. Mm-hmm. The problem was that it wasn't told upfront way in advance that was the case to like the broader spectrum of things. So a lot of people I would say a lot, but there were some very vocal people that were saying, I paid money to do this and now I'm not allowed to go. And this is the one thing that I was really looking forward to doing. Another was, I made mention of it, where there was, we in the last event, we had people who submitted challenges that were considered stakeholders. So they were looking to, they had a sprint brief that had a vision, mission, success criteria, the audience, they had it all predefined for the group. Yet one person wanted to say, you know what, I think we should actually do this because I know a few people that do this, and try to get consensus with the group, and the group was fine with it. But that one person who spent a lot of time doing all the necessary work and doing all of the right things to submit their brief and submit their idea felt like the entire thing was being hijacked. And they just left and said, I don't want my money back, but I'll never come back again. And sometimes it's just the dynamicism of humans that kind of make this happen. Even if you try to do damage control, you try to conflict resolution, it's just things happen.
Yeah. And now, what does your code of conduct then consists of in its core?
So there are a few things that I heard over time from different people when it comes to kind of having the right balance of perspective, but also tolerance of where things go. Mm-hmm. And when I originally wrote it and kind of drafted it up, it was primarily reflecting what I was kept on hearing from people. The first one is empathy, where for many first-time participants, as well as return guests, being able to walk in someone else's shoes is essential. Responsiveness, which is pretty much either the people that are part of the event or myself, being able to respond to things that are happening within 24 hours. So if it's broken, I'm going to do my best to make sure it's right. If other people on the team need relevant information, that the idea is that you're going to try to respond in due kind. The one thing that was a problem in previous ones, and there's another one, was commitment. If you're signing up for this, I'm going to commit to be able to try to give you the best experience out of the event. But likewise, you're with a team of 6 to 7 other people that are also taking time out from their families, from their workplaces, from other things they could be doing with their time, and they want to work through this process and learn from it. So the idea is that if everyone's kind of pitching in, you as a participant will probably do that as well. Then there's other things like transparency, making sure everyone knows that I'm doing this in a way that's not even, offhanded, where I'm going to be handing their personal data over to somebody else. Mm-hmm. That if there's challenges to how the process goes or with how things are going, that people are free to kind of voice those, whether they're public or private. I'm totally fine with that as long as it's respectful, which is another tenet of the code of conduct. And then there's inclusivity, where we're not necessarily discriminatory against like gender identity, expression, race, culture, national origin, all that stuff. So I make it declared because sometimes it can be implied. And given what's been happening this year culturally, I think it's important to kind of really state that. And then privacy and security, which I mentioned before, that's the other one that came in, is that I want to make it clear that when I keep personal information from people that signed up, I'm not leveraging this for my own benefit. I'm keeping it squared away, not going to be touched by anybody else. And that usually it stays in a sheet where I don't even look at it. It only gets used for like a newsletter if people opt in. But but that code of conduct was necessary to level set for future events like this one and others, that this is the kind of culture I'm trying to establish within this sort of event.
And I would be very curious to learn from you whether it was effective, whether it had an impact that participants sign and agree upfront that they will take the time and do the best to really be present at the committed time. Because I think that's, as you mentioned, it's a big problem of online events, that people get more quickly distracted and do other meetings in between. And what I learned from experiments in behavioral sciences is just the pure fact of asking people to sign an agreement officially already makes them to commit stronger and to stick to the agreement.
Yeah, I think that's key. Doing it offline, doing it ahead of time, knowing that it's something that even if they forget everything that they agreed to, that there's this understanding intuitively that there's a social contract that kind of binds people together in the event. And I usually reinforce it with one last kind of shout out to say, okay, just to reflect before we start sprint week, this is the code of conduct that you agreed to when you signed up. Just review it really fast, and that's all you really need. I don't declare it in person or as part of a video or anything else, because then there's too much of an emphasis on that where people feel like they're pigeonholed. But it's just to know that there is a sandbox. And if I call people out on it in private, it's usually because it's self-evident, and it could be an interpretation of a definition, but most of the time it never gets there.
I really like it because it also shows, as you say, it defines a sandbox and makes it explicit, the rules by which we are playing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It feels really weird being the person to answer all the questions, because normally I'm the person that asks the questions to the other person. So I'm totally taken aback. I'm like, man, I've been talking for a long time. Yes. And I'm just not used to it. I'm usually used to like, so Miriam, tell me all about your podcast.
But I invited you to answer my questions.
I know.
I'm very glad you do.
I'm just not used to it.
I think you're doing a brilliant job.
Well, thank you. I feel like this has been a very enriching conversation. No, I've enjoyed it. It's been fun.
Yes, and we have a few minutes left. Before we started recording, you shared that you had 14 kickoffs this week.
Yeah.
for your fifth GVDS
Yep.
after 14
So
kickoffs. If someone listens to it and wants to learn 3 things, the learnings of the week.
the learnings of the week, 3 things that I learned from doing 14 2-hour kickoffs. One is that you will iteratively learn what you didn't get right in the first 5 kickoffs that you will have to reapply to those first 5 kickoffs when you apply them to your next 10. Case in point is the to-do list. I didn't think to put a to-do list for next steps for people on the team. And when it was suggested, I put that in there. Everyone felt like they had something to do between now and next week. So I had to circle back around to the first 5 teams and kind of give them a chance to kind of write their own script as well.
So
Second is...
Just one
Go
second.
ahead.
So the to-do list would be for the team to write their own to-do list. It's not you providing them with a to-do list.
No.
Okay.
They, based on the topic that we've been exploring, or the topics they explore themselves, or the tools that they sign up to kind of understand. So everyone owns a particular tool in the team, rather than just having the facilitator own everything, to something that when we were figuring out their role, that they said they were actively learning. One task that they can do between now and their discovery meeting next week that they can take on offline and then share with the group in Slack. So that's that approach. The second thing for doing, and this is probably obvious on his face, is lots of preparation. You need to get everything done for these discovery sessions at least 2 weeks in advance, if you can, because there's going to be other things that are going to get your attention, whether they're, I can't find X, or am I supposed to be in the right spot for Y? And, am I on Z team? Those questions will come in pretty fast and furious. Plus you have your marketing to do. So it's just a balance of getting everything together and getting it right. But getting as much done as you can way in advance is going to help you go a long way. Third, and I've learned this a long time ago, but it's worth repeating, take it easy on yourself. Yeah, I'm sleep deprived right now, so I haven't gotten a lot of sleep, but rightfully so. It's a sacrifice that's needed to make sure that 15 groups of people feel like they're going off in the right direction and not feeling lost. But know that if you didn't get it right for all 15 teams, like there's one team that just, you get the vibe of the energy, it's not quite right, that's okay. You can't be Superman all the time, whether it's to the process, to people. You really are dealing with a diverse group. You just have to believe and work through the idea that you're doing your best, and everyone else is there to kind of, they're secretly rooting for you to succeed in their own way. So you just got to be kind to yourself with this stuff. And more often than not, if you do your best, or try to do your best, even if it does fall short in some aspects for yourself, it's usually enough. And you just have to kind of give yourself the benefit of the doubt in that regard.
And I think the group also senses your genuine care and that you're trying and doing your best. And then usually they're quite forgiving.
Yeah, it's usually reflected in how they talk about you. Plus, when you see social media posts about what you're doing, and they're not from you, but they're from other people, that's usually a good visual indication, social proof that you may be doing something right.
Nice. As we're approaching the hour, I have one final question for you.
I'm ready.
If someone fell asleep after minute 1 of our conversation, just woke up and doesn't have time to listen to the hour again, what would you like them to take away as the one nugget?
So if they fell asleep at minute 1,
and they don't have time to listen to the entire show again,
one nugget that they would take away. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction was take a nap, because you need the sleep. If you're falling asleep 1 minute after this, then you really shouldn't be doing a podcast. You should really take some melatonin, or just get a nice place to kind of lay down and just relax, and let the waves of tiredness fall over you. Maybe I'm speaking to myself here. So the very high level one nugget thing: do the work. Don't talk about it. Don't think that basically by reading a book it's going to make it happen. And certainly having conversations about with people and what you're going to do is fantastic, but you got to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
Do the work. You got to do it. If you really want to understand, experience it, got to do the work. That's all there is to it.
Wonderful.
It's like, what did Yoda say? He says, do or do not. There is no try. That's pretty much the same thing.
So much wisdom in that. Yeah. Either you do or you don't. It's very binary.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your learnings and taking the time for this conversation, despite your very filled schedule, I guess, and overspilling email box.
Well, with both of us kind of a bit fried from the week, I think it made for an interesting conversation, even if it was just one person kind of spouting off on what's been going on. I think hopefully it was beneficial for everybody listening, and they took away something that they could use, or they got a new perspective on things.
Yes, absolutely. And I will put all the links to connect to you, to follow you in the show notes.
Sounds great.
And I hope to see you at Never Done Before, obviously.
I hope so as well.
Wonderful. See you there.
Thank you for listening to the Workshops Work podcast with Dr. Miriam Haynes, the founder of Workshops Work. If you'd like to listen to the podcast, you can subscribe to iTunes. You can also get the ebook, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. Make sure you join us for the Never Done Before Facilitation Festival coming up soon.